Stirling, welcome to In Pit Lane.
Thank you, it's lovely to be here.
Now, it's very hard to know where to start with a career like yours going back for so many, many years, but let's start, the motor racing connection started with your father. Your father raced at Indianapolis and Brooklands. What are your memories of that?
Well, my memories, of course, I didn't see my father race at all. In fact, he gave up racing when he married my mother, because she said, I'm not going to be married to a racer or something, although he was a dentist. But I was brought up with fast cars. My mother was very good, because my father, when he gave up racing, they together went as a team in trials and rallies, up muddy hills and so on. So I was brought up with fast cars, and both my mother and father were deeply connected.
Because I was going to ask you, in those days there weren't sort of so many professional racing drivers about. I was going to ask where your father got the money, but you sort of answered that as a dentist. What about your school days? When did you first take a real interest in motorsport?
Amazingly late, actually, when I think about it. I think it was probably when I was 15 or 16. I'd read Prince Chula Chakraborty's book about Prince Bira, who'd done a lot of racing as a semi-amateur, before the war, and I thought, my gosh, it must be a really exciting life. And I looked in the paper, and I happened to find an ad for a car that somebody was going to build, a 500cc Formula 3 car. Well, I'd got some money I'd won riding horses, because I was allowed to keep any money I won, and I wrote a cheque for 50 quid as a deposit. My father happened to be going through my chequebook. He said, "What's this?" And I had to own up. And he was furious. He said, "No way you're going to be going to racing. We can't afford it." I had a Morgan three-wheeler at that time on the road, and he took that away. And of course, I was chasing girls, and to go for a meeting with a girlfriend on a bicycle was a hell of a lot different than in a Morgan three-wheeler, So I did have a struggle getting him to agree to let me try it for a year, which I did. And luckily I was successful enough that a man called John Heath, who was racing in Europe, going to race a team in Europe, asked me if I'd like to join him.
So what was the car that you were running with John Heath at the time when you started racing with him?
Yeah, well, that was the HWM. HWM, which stands for Hersham Walton Motors. And at the time it was a Bitzer, obviously, a bits of this, bits of that. Had an Alta engine running on alcohol, I remember, and then a pre-selected gearbox, which obviously put the weight up. And we weren't really competitive against Ferrari or the Gordinis, in truth. But because we were English, the only green car out there, because I was very young, which is good from the point of view of getting start money and so on, we managed to sort of pay enough that John carried on, and so I went all around Europe with him and his cars, and of course started driving sports cars with Jaguar as well.
Back in those days, nowadays Formula 1 drivers stick to Formula 1. We've spoken about this with Sir Jack at times, but back in those days, sports car racing was every bit as big as Formula 1, probably even bigger.
Yeah. Oh, very much so. To have as I did, a contract with Jaguar, of course, was much, as you can imagine, much more remunerative and much better than having it with say, HWM. It was totally different. Now, of course, drivers are expected to bring money or find money because of the sponsorship. The sponsorship deal, we weren't allowed to. I've never raced with any adverts on myself at all, other than Dunlop or Pirelli, because that's all. For whatever reason, it was accepted that you could put the name of your tire company on your overalls. I don't know why this happened, but it was. But otherwise, you see, I haven't had any advertising on my overalls at all.
Yeah, was this before or just after the war?
This was just after the war. The first event I ever did was in 1947, which was with a 328 BMW my father had owned. And he said, "All right, you can have a go in a couple of hill climbs," because there was no racing as such, because of the shortage of petrol, and of course we don't race on the roads in England. Then after that is when I went and joined John Heath, got into Europe.
So who were the people you were competing against at the time? You mentioned some of the cars like Ferrari and Gordini. Who were some of the drivers?
You've got people like Ascari and Farina and Villaresi. Really, there were some, at the time, there were some extremely good drivers, very, very good drivers.
You mentioned a couple of people there. Ascari is one of the famous names, of course, and his name sort of lives on today. Most people will know of his name. What sort of a competitor was he?
Oh, he had a much faster and better car, if you like, than mine. He was driving for the Alpha team, and the Alpha team, we got he and Farina and I think Fagioli, I forget now. And then, of course, you've got the Gordini team when you've got the French people who are very good. And then you had the English ones, and we were there really to make up. We occasionally would get a third place. I mean, that's about better than we would have hoped for, though, really.
You moved on after that. You sort of moved on into the 50s, and you started to really make a profile for yourself with Mercedes, amongst other people. We're going to take a break now on In Pit Lane with Stirling Moss, and when we come back, we're going to find out all about racing in the 1950s and the famous era with Mercedes. Welcome back to In Pit Lane. Our guest is Sir Stirling Moss. Stirling, after your original time back in the 1950s, particularly in the mid-50s, you raced for Mercedes, and as you said, it wasn't that long after the war. Was there any problems in those days about a young English driver racing for a German team?
Well, I was in those days very patriotic. I mean, we had some reason to be so, because I'm terribly pro-English and everything. Well, now, of course, there's no such thing as patriotism. But then I only wanted to drive green cars. And I can remember it quite well, actually, when it was suggested by Alfred Neubauer to my father, when my father spoke to him and said, will you try me out, give me a test. He said, look, we've seen how well he can do on pretty moderate cars. We really would like to see how well he can go on a decent car, and to see whether he'd drive for Mercedes next year. Now, we're talking now 1954. And Neubauer's suggestion was that we got a competitive vehicle, so the only place we could go where they'd sell cars, because Ferrari didn't sell them, he raced, was to Maserati. So my father went to Maserati, and we managed to negotiate to buy a car, and they would they wouldn't look after it, but they would keep it up to date. In other words, if they had a modification, they would allow me to purchase it and put on my car. So that's how it really worked.
So what model Maserati was that? Was that the 250F, or was this beforehand?
250F, which was a fantastic car. I mean, obviously, every year the car was changed. You've got the short wheelbase and the Piccolo and the lightweight and the God knows what. But in principle, the 250F was a really nice, good Formula One car. Not as reliable, maybe, or as well built as a Ferrari, but a really, really nice car to drive.
You mentioned Ferrari a couple of times. I understand that Enzo Ferrari, you didn't exactly hit it off with Enzo Ferrari first of all.
No, I didn't, because this is when I was 20 years old, and when you heard Ferrari, boy, you crossed yourself and faced Modena, and I had an invite to go down and drive the new car, which was a 4-cylinder, because all his were 12, and to drive this little place called Bari in southern Italy. So of course I went with my father, said this is fantastic, went down there, found the garage, and I knew the car because it was only 4-cylinder Ferrari. And I got in, and I'm sort of fiddling around, and the mechanic said, what are you doing? I said, well, my name's Stirling Moss, and I'm driving this. He said, I'm sorry, you're not. I said, what do you mean I'm not? He said, well, I'm saying Taruf is driving it. Well, Taruf is a good driver, and nothing against him, but I thought Ferrari was pretty bad not to have told me, and I really felt very teed off. And I sort of vowed I'd never race for him. And in fact, I did race a Ferrari on 14 occasions with considerable success. I won 12 of the races, actually, but never for Ferrari, always private cars. So until just before the end of my career in '61, he called me up and said, would I mind going to see him? And which, of course, I did. I flew down to Modena Maranello. I saw him, and he said, look, tell me what car you want, I'll build it for you, and I'd like to support you and everything else. And so I told him I wanted a 246, which was the car then, which he built, and I wanted it painted in Rob Walker blue, because he was my patron, the guy I drove for, with a white band round the nose, and in fact he did that, but unfortunately, of course, I had my crash, and that ruined it.
Now, 1955 was an amazing year for you. You won many things, the Mille Miglia, the Tourist Trophy. Was the Tourist Trophy back in those days almost as good for a British driver as winning the British Grand Prix?
Oh yeah, I mean the Mille Miglia, the Targa Florio, and the TT were all the highest echelon of sports cars, and therefore they carried, I think, the same amount of points for the BRDC Gold Star, and of course they were respected by everybody, so they were very important. Yeah, very important.
Now, in those days, you were racing with Mercedes, and you had a teammate called Fangio, one of the legends. What sort of a driver was he, and why was he so successful?
To my mind, Fangio is the greatest Formula One driver who ever lived. I mean, absolutely tremendous. It's difficult to compare him with, say, if you like, some of the modern ones because times are different. I mean, now motor racing, thank God, is very safe. Then it wasn't. It was very dangerous. It's a different mindset. But he was an absolute gentleman, charming guy. Regrettably, he couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak Spanish. So we got away with sort of hands and things like that. We're only talking about cars and crumpet, let's face it. So we'd be talking using our hands and like that. But a lovely man, really.
And in both cases, it's an international language, cars and crumpet. It doesn't matter what language you speak. Somehow we manage to understand each other, don't we?
Exactly. I mean, he really was a super guy from Argentina, and I had greatest respect. Funnily enough, for whatever reason, I could beat him in sports cars, but not in Formula One. And to me, Formula One is the pinnacle. You know, that's the thing to do.
Well, you did beat him in one Formula One race, your first Formula One race, which was the British Grand Prix. There was some conjecture at the time that he may have done a gentlemanly thing and pulled over. He always denied that very vehemently. What do you think?
I don't know. Honestly and truly, when we'd finished, I said to him, I said, did you let me do it? And he said, it was your day. Now, how can I tell from that? I mean, what I do know is that the race started, he got quite a good lead on him myself. I caught him up when he was have difficulty passing a back marker, and then I managed to get into the lead because I forget exactly why, and I went as hard as I could, and he was behind me. And when we finished up, I came around the last corner. I remember so well, around the last corner at Aintree, and I pulled over and I waved him through on the inside with my foot flat on the floor. And I thought, boy, if you pass me out of that corner, then your car's half faster than mine. And of course it wasn't. They built the best car they could. And so I won by half a car length. So I still haven't got an answer, really.
Well, obviously, there's more to come. We're going to take another break now on In Pit Lane. Our special guest is Sir Stirling Moss, and we'll be right back after this. Well, we're talking once again with Sir Stirling Moss, and Sir Stirling, we talked about some of the good things of 1955. One of the bad things that will live on forever is the 1955 Le Mans 24-hour race. Now, you were actually leading that race at the time when the word came through from Mercedes to that they were going to pull out. What are your memories of that race, and how did you feel when they made that decision?
Well, I must say, in truth, I was very much against the decision. I couldn't see any point. I mean, we're talking about 4 o'clock in the morning now, so a long time after. It certainly couldn't bring anybody back to life. And I thought, well, you know, why do it? I mean, what's the reason? It was actually John Fitch who said, call the directors. I think we should retire. I don't know why. I think it was a mistake all along. Of course, it affected me because it was a very important race, you know. And Fangio and I certainly had it in the bag. I mean, we had, I think, 4 laps lead at that time, and Hawthorne and Bueb in the Jaguar, we certainly could cope with them because we didn't have the brakes they did, but we had superior power and we had the air brake and everything. So it was I just was very disappointed, frankly. But I could understand what he's saying, but I don't think it was helpful.
Were you aware, I mean, obviously you're focusing on the race at the time, were you aware of the scope of the tragedy when you were out there?
Oh yes, it was absolutely appalling. I mean, I was standing on the pits waiting to take over, and Fangio went through, and then Hawthorne came across, and he pulled in across poor old Lance Macklin, and then Lebec went up the back. I mean, it was a dreadful set of circumstances, and I can remember so well sort of seeing this car flash across, and it was... Obviously, they wanted people not to panic. They wanted to get the ambulances in and so on and so forth. It was absolutely a disaster, and I can't see what anybody could have done to have improved the situation, really.
So ultimately, you think the ACO made the right decision, continuing the race?
Oh, I'm sure they did. Otherwise, you've got 250,000 people all saying, "Oh, I'm going home." The ambulances couldn't get in and out. I mean, in those days, I don't think we even had an air ambulance. You know, I don't think they existed in that time.
Moving forward, jumping forward a considerable amount back into the 60s, you had your big crash. After, I mean, that's been very well documented. Afterwards, you came back and you drove once again. Were reasonably competitive in terms of the time, but you basically said, "No, not ready yet." Or what was the reason? What did you feel at the time?
It was awful decision, quite easily made because it was the only one I think I should have made. It was awful because I really wanted to go back into the sport I knew, but the trouble I found going round, my concentration hadn't come back. That is the big thing, and therefore I was going into the course, I knew exactly what I should do, but I wasn't doing them automatically. It's rather like if I swing at you like this and you don't duck, you're going to realise there's something wrong. Well, it was a bit like that, and I thought, this is terrible. I think I should, in hindsight, if I'd waited 3 years, I think maybe my concentration would come all right. But the times change. I mean, you've got Jimmy Clark, of course, came through. Cars changed. We went to slicks and so on, and it just wasn't a viable proposition. So I made a decision that was easy to make at the time, which I think probably was the right one.
Well, you made something of a comeback to racing, particularly in historics, but also Australia figures in that as well. With I think it was an L34, perhaps an A9 Exterrana with our friend Sir Jack Brabham. What do you remember? How did that all come about?
Well, I'll tell you, Jack and I, of course, were great enemies on the track, we're good friends off it and so on. And when I was offered the idea of driving with Jack, I thought, terrific. And I said to Jack, Jack, every race I've ever been in with you, you go before the flag's even fallen. So you're in Australia. If you jump the start, they're not going to worry too much. So you go first, you see. And Jack's there, and I'm expecting him to go off like a ruddy rabbit, And for whatever reason, he stalled on the line. Of course, somebody behind bashed the back end up and did our car quite a bit of damage. So really, it came to nothing. But I have to laugh at the situation. I mean, here were the Jack and myself together in the same car, and I hope to think with a chance of success. And it came to nothing beyond the start line, really.
And of course, it was I think it was a triumph that actually sort of took you out. So a bit of British justice there, taking you out in the end.
Oh, I didn't realise what it was actually.
Dolomite, if I remember correctly.
Ah, well, you remember better than I do. I can't remember. If I look in my diary, I probably confirm it. Yes.
Let's move on to Monde. Now, you keep abreast with what is happening around. What do you think of the sport today? I mean, probably the major change, you mentioned advertising before, has been brought about by a man who's not a driver. He was very briefly, but a fellow called by the name of Bernie Eccleston. What do you think of the direction he's taken the sport in?
He gets a lot of flack, and I must say that I think he's really done a lot for motor racing. I mean, you can't blame him for when there's money coming in, taking a lot of it, which he did, and fair enough. But if you look at the Formula One now, wherever they go, everything is so neat. The trucks are all lined up. I mean, it's a very slick operation. So I think that's great. It's not the sort of racing that I enjoy, because I much prefer the older type cars and the way racing was. But you can't go backwards. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I think considering the way it is, the biggest problem we have, you see, the cars are now all so good that the driver input towards success is reduced. Not because they haven't got the ability, because they have, but because the cars, when you start at such a high plane, that's why you get the whole field maybe covered by 2 seconds, which is ridiculous, really, because the drivers, obviously, there is a much bigger gap than that would indicate. I mean, between the people like, Mark Webber, for instance, and the slower guy, there is really quite a big gap, but it doesn't show up.
Do you think that in this day and age with the intense media scrutiny, how do you think you would have gone? I mean, we saw Lewis Hamilton here at the Australian Grand Prix. He did a burnout leaving the track and he was written up as if he'd robbed a bank or something. I mean, how do you think you'd go in the days of yourself and Graham Hill and Jim Clark and all those people after the race, having a few drinks after the race and enjoying yourself and enjoying the crumpet, as it were?
Yeah, well, I suppose you have to live with the time, I mean, I don't understand it. I really don't think I'd have fitted in that well, to tell you the truth. I mean, I race because I love racing, and when I had to give it up and work for a living when I was 32, it nearly killed me. I mean, the idea of not doing what I love doing and then having to go out and work instead is appalling. So I reckon I had the best time that you could get. I think the quality of life, say between, if you like, Lewis and myself, is enormous. I mean, my quality of life far higher. I mean, when the race is over, I go off chasing crumpet. What does he do? He has to go to Vodafone and talk to them. I mean, you can't compare it, can you, really? Although
I have seen the standard of Lewis's crumpet, and it's very, very nice. Thank you very much.
That's very, very true, I must admit. Yes, he's got a good one there.
Well, it's been an absolute honour and a privilege. I mean, as we said, it's so hard sort of finding the little bits to take out. There's so much we could talk to you about, but you're very busy. Thank you for giving up your time with us here on In Pit Lane today. But for now, Sir Stirling Moss, thanks for joining us in Pit Lane.
Thank you, and I look forward to our next trip to Australia, because we have a lovely time here. Really do.